The dust swirled around the weathered boots of Samuel Hartwell as he stood outside the Copper Creek Saloon, watching the sun bleed orange across the Arizona Territory sky. The year was 1882, and the frontier was still wild enough to break a man's spirit or forge it into something stronger than steel. Samuel had seen both happen more times than he cared to count in his 34 years, most of them spent with a gun on his hip and the horizon as his only constant companion. The sound of raised voices drifted through the saloon's batwing doors, cutting through the evening air like a rusty blade. Samuel had been nursing his whiskey in solitude when the argument began, but something about the desperation in one particular voice had drawn him outside. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Through the grimy window, he could see Thomas Brennan, a once proud rancher whose spread had been failing for the better part of 2 years. Drought, rustlers, and a series of bad decisions had reduced the man to a shadow of his former self. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd already sold pieces of his soul just to survive another day. Across from Brennan sat Marcus Volkov, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of death. Volkov controlled most of the gambling and lending in 3 counties, and his methods of collection were as ruthless as they were effective. The Russian immigrant had arrived in the territory 5 years prior with nothing but cunning and cruelty, building an empire on the misfortunes of desperate men. But it was the third figure in the scene that made Samuel's blood run cold. Eleanor Brennan sat rigid in her chair, her 19-year-old face pale as winter snow, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that couldn't hide her natural beauty. Her green eyes, so much like her late mother's, darted between her father and Volkov with the trapped look of a wild animal sensing the approach of hunters. "The debt is $600, Brennan," Volkov's accented voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "You have had 3 months to pay, 3 months of my considerable patience." Thomas Brennan's hands shook as he reached for his drink. "I told you I need more time. The cattle market will turn around, and I can pay you back with interest." Volkov laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "The cattle market? You have no cattle left worth mentioning. Your ranch is mortgaged beyond its value. You have nothing left to offer me except—" His cold gaze settled on Eleanor, who visibly flinched. "Except your daughter? Papa?" "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a prayer. Thomas couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. "She's a good girl. Pure. She can cook and clean, and she's got her mother's gentle nature. Surely that's worth the debt." Samuel's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He'd seen desperation drive men to terrible choices before, but selling one's own blood was a level of degradation that made his stomach churn. Through the window, he watched Eleanor's face crumble as the reality of her father's words sank in. "I am not unreasonable, man," Volkov said, stroking his well-groomed beard. "Your daughter is indeed beautiful specimen. I accept this arrangement. She will work in my establishment until debt is paid plus interest. Should take perhaps 2, maybe 3 years." Everyone in the territory knew what working in Volkov's establishment meant for a young woman. It was a sentence worse than death, a slow destruction of everything that made a person human. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a sob, while her father stared into his whiskey as if seeking absolution in its amber depths. Samuel had heard enough. He pushed through the batwing doors with enough force to make them slam against the walls, announcing his presence like a gunshot. The conversation died instantly as 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "Evening, gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd faced down death and found it wanting. "Miss Eleanor." He touched the brim of his hat respectfully, noting how she straightened slightly at the gesture of courtesy. "This is private business, cowboy," Volkov said, his hand moving instinctively toward the ivory, handled pistol at his side. "I suggest you find somewhere else to drink." Samuel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's where you're wrong, friend. See, I couldn't help but overhear your business proposition, and it strikes me that you might be interested in hearing a counter offer." Thomas Brennan looked up from his drink, hope and confusion warring in his weathered features. "Samuel, what are you doing?" The 2 men had known each other for years, back when Brennan's ranch was thriving and Samuel had worked briefly as a hired hand during a particularly harsh winter. Thomas had treated him fairly then, and Samuel had never forgotten the man's kindness to a drifter with nowhere else to go. "I'm making a business proposition of my own," Samuel replied, never taking his eyes off Volkov. "How much was that debt again?" $600, Volkov said slowly, his calculating mind already working through the implications. "Plus interest and fees, let us say 700 total." Samuel reached into his vest pocket and produced a leather pouch, the weight of it causing the table to creak when he set it down. "There's $800 in gold coin right there. More than enough to settle Mr. Brennan's debt and provide some extra for your troubles." The saloon had fallen completely silent, with even the piano player stopping mid-song to listen. Volkov's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel with new interest. "And what exactly do you want in return for this generous gesture?" Volkov asked. "The girl comes with me," Samuel said simply, free and clear with no obligations to anyone in this room. Eleanor gasped, her green eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Thomas started to speak, but Samuel held up a hand to silence him. "No, before anyone gets the wrong idea," Samuel continued, "I'm not buying the lady like a head of cattle. I'm paying off a debt that would otherwise see her trapped in a situation no decent woman should endure. What happens after that is entirely up to her." Volkov picked up the pouch, testing its weight with practiced hands. "You would pay $800 for a girl you do not even know. This seems like poor business sense, my friend." "Maybe so," Samuel admitted, "but I've made worse investments. At least this one lets me sleep at night." The Russian's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "You interest me, cowboy, very well. I accept your offer." He stood and pocketed the gold, then looked down at Thomas with undisguised contempt. "Your debt is settled, Brennan. Do not darken my door again with your failures." As Volkov swept from the saloon with his men in tow, Thomas finally found the courage to meet his daughter's gaze. What he saw there made him flinch worse than a physical blow. "Eleanor, he began. "Don't," she said quietly, standing with as much dignity as she could muster. "Just don't." She turned to Samuel, who was still standing by the table like a statue carved from granite. "Why?" she asked simply. Samuel studied her face, seeing strength beneath the fear, steel beneath the sorrow. "Because everyone deserves a choice in their own life, Miss Eleanor. And because your mother was a good woman who showed kindness to a stranger once upon a time." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of the evening crashed over her. Without a word, Samuel offered her his arm, and she took it gratefully, allowing him to escort her from the saloon and away from the wreckage of her former life. The night air was cool against their faces as they walked through the dusty streets of Copper Creek. Samuel's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, waited patiently at the hitching post outside the general store. Eleanor stopped suddenly, pulling her arm free from his. "I need to know," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. "What do you expect from me? What kind of arrangement is this?" Samuel turned to face her fully, his expression serious but kind. "The only arrangement is that you're free to make your own choices. I've got a small spread about 20 miles north of here, nothing fancy but it's clean and honest. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to figure out what you want to do with your life. No obligations, no expectations beyond common courtesy. And if I want to leave, then you leave. I'll give you enough money to get started somewhere new, and that'll be the end of it." Eleanor searched his face in the moonlight, looking for deception or hidden motives. What she found instead was a wariness that matched her own, the kind that came from seeing too much of the world's cruelty and still choosing to do right when the opportunity presented itself. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "Because you don't have much choice right now," Samuel replied honestly. "But also because I give you my word as a man, and that still means something out here." She nodded slowly, wiping the last of her tears with the back of her hand. "What about my things? My father's ranch? Your father made his choices tonight. As for your belongings, we can collect them in the morning if you want. Tonight, I think distance is the wisest course." They rode through the darkness in comfortable silence, Eleanor riding behind Samuel on Thunder's broad back. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the gentle sway of the horse's gait gradually eased some of the tension from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching safety. Samuel's ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a small main house, a barn, and a corral for his horses. The buildings were weathered but solid, speaking of a man who took care of what was his without concern for appearances. As they approached, a dog emerged from the shadows, tail wagging at Samuel's familiar scent. "That's Blue," Samuel said, dismounting and helping Eleanor down. "He's friendly enough." Just don't try to pet him while he's eating. The inside of the house was spartanly furnished but clean, with handmade furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Samuel lit a lamp, casting warm light across the simple room. "There's a bedroom at the back you can use," he said, gathering some blankets from a chest. "I'll bunk out here on the sofa tonight, give you some privacy to settle in." Eleanor looked around the modest space, noting the absence of feminine touches or family photographs. "You live alone?" "For the last 3 years, yes. Before that," he paused, his expression growing distant. "Before that I had a wife, Sarah. She died of fever the winter before last." The simple statement carried such weight of grief that Eleanor felt her own troubles momentarily pale in comparison. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Life out here doesn't much care about our plans," Samuel replied. "But we keep going anyway? Because that's what the good ones would want us to do." Over the following days, Eleanor slowly began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life. Samuel was true to his word, asking nothing of her beyond sharing meals and occasional conversation. She helped with cooking and cleaning because it gave her something to do, not because it was expected. Gradually, the haunted look in her green eyes began to fade, replaced by something approaching peace. Samuel was unlike any man she'd ever known. He spoke little but listened well, treated her with consistent respect, and never made her feel like a burden or an obligation. His days were filled with the endless tasks of maintaining a small ranch, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, breaking horses for sale to the army fort 30 miles east. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor finally broke the comfortable silence that had become their custom. "Tell me about her," she said. "Your wife." Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft with memory. "Sarah was a teacher back in Missouri. Came out here with a missionary group, planning to educate the children of settlers and ranch hands. I was working for the railroad then, laying track through hostile territory. She patched up a bullet wound for me one day, and I just never found a reason to leave." He smiled at the memory, the first truly happy expression Eleanor had seen from him. "She was tiny, barely came up to my shoulder, but she had more courage than most men I've ridden with. She'd face down Apache warriors to protect her students, then turn around and nurse their wounded without a second thought." "How did you end up here?" "After the railroad work was done, we bought this land with our savings. Sarah wanted to start a school, and I figured ranching would be steady work. We had plans." His voice trailed off, the pain still fresh despite the passage of time. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand gently on his arm. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. "And she would have liked you, I think. You've got that same quality she had, that ability to keep your dignity no matter what the world throws at you." The comparison should have felt presumptuous, but coming from Samuel it felt like the highest form of praise. Eleanor found herself blinking back tears for the second time since arriving at the ranch. But these were different from the desperate sobs of that first night. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of something that might eventually become healing. As autumn turned to winter, Eleanor's place at the ranch became less temporary and more natural. She discovered talents she'd never known she possessed, a gift for gentling horses, an intuitive understanding of weather patterns, and a surprising aptitude for the practical skills frontier life demanded. Samuel, for his part, found his grief slowly transforming into something more manageable. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum to his lost dreams, but rather a home where two wounded souls had found unexpected companionship. Their conversations grew longer and more personal, covering everything from childhood memories to hopes for the future. The turning point came on a bitter December night when rustlers attempted to steal Samuel's cattle. Eleanor woke to the sound of gunfire and found Samuel preparing to ride out alone into the darkness. "You can't go by yourself," she said, already reaching for her coat. "This isn't your fight, Eleanor. Stay inside where it's safe." "This ranch is my home too now," she replied firmly. "Those cattle represent our future. Not just yours." The unconscious use of "our" wasn't lost on either of them, but there was no time to analyze the implications. Together they rode out into the freezing night, Eleanor proving herself as capable with a rifle as she was with everything else she'd put her mind to learning. They managed to drive off the rustlers and save most of the herd, but not without cost. Samuel took a bullet in the shoulder, and Eleanor found herself playing doctor by lamplight in the barn, her hands steady despite her fear. You could have been killed tonight, she whispered as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. So could you, he replied, wincing as she pulled the bandage tight. Why did you risk it? Eleanor paused, her hands still on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through the cotton. Because this is worth fighting for. This life we've built here, this peace we've found. I won't lose it without a fight. Samuel looked up at her, seeing not the frightened girl he'd rescued from the saloon, but a woman of strength and substance who'd chosen to make her stand beside him. Eleanor, he said quietly. Yes, I need you to know that what started as charity has become something else entirely. You're not an obligation or a burden. He struggled to find words that wouldn't insult her or presume too much. I know, she said softly, her green eyes bright with unshaded tears. I feel it too. The kiss that followed was gentle, hesitant, full of the careful tenderness of two people who'd been hurt before and were afraid to hope for happiness again. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard. I love you, Samuel said, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. I love you too, Eleanor whispered back. But Samuel, I need you to know that I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Not because I owe you or because I have nowhere else to go, but because you're a good man and I want to build a life with you. Are you sure? Because once we go down this path, I'm sure, she interrupted, her voice strong with conviction. I was sold like livestock by my own father, but what I give you I give freely. My heart, my loyalty, my future. All of it freely given to a man who showed me that I was worth saving when everyone else, including myself, had given up. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. Eleanor and Samuel were married in a simple ceremony at the small church in Copper Creek, with only a few close friends and neighbors in attendance. Thomas Brennan was notably absent, having sold what remained of his ranch and disappeared into the territory's vastness, unable to face the daughter he'd betrayed. Eleanor felt no bitterness about her father's absence. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. She'd learned that family wasn't always about blood, and that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. As she stood beside Samuel, speaking vows that meant more to her than any contract or obligation ever could, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been chattel in a business transaction, her future decided by desperate men in a smoke-filled saloon. Now she was a woman choosing her own destiny, loved and respected by a man who'd proven himself worthy of her trust. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors contributing food and music for an evening of celebration that stretched well into the night. As Eleanor danced with her new husband under a canopy of stars, she caught sight of the spot where they'd first kissed, where they'd first acknowledged the love that had grown between them like wildflowers after rain. What are you thinking about? Samuel asked, following her gaze. Just remembering, Eleanor replied. Thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we never knew we wanted. Samuel spun her gently, her simple blue dress flaring out around her legs. Do you ever regret it? Staying here instead of taking that money and starting fresh somewhere else? Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. Never, not for a single moment. This is exactly where I belong. Years passed, bringing with them the usual mixture of triumph and hardship that frontier life demanded. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, growing from a modest operation to one of the most respected spreads in the territory. Eleanor's natural gift with horses led to a profitable side business breeding and training mounts for the cavalry, while Samuel's reputation for honesty and fair dealing made him a sought-after partner for other ranchers. They weathered droughts and floods, good years and lean ones, always together, always united in their purpose. 3 children blessed their union: Sarah, named for Samuel's first wife, then Thomas and Mary, their names carrying hopes for the future rather than ghosts from the past. Eleanor proved to be as fierce a mother as she was a partner, protecting her children with the same determination she'd once shown defending the ranch from rustlers. She taught them to read and write, to treat all people with dignity regardless of station, and to never let anyone else define their worth. Samuel often marveled at the woman his wife had become, or perhaps had always been beneath the circumstances that had nearly destroyed her. The frightened girl from the saloon had given way to a confident woman who could deliver a foal, negotiate cattle prices, and still have energy left to read bedtime stories to their children. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, They would sit on the porch they'd built together, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about the day's events or plans for the future. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands entwined, grateful for the peace they'd found in each other. One such evening, as Eleanor approached her 40th birthday and Samuel his 55th, she turned to him with the same directness that had always characterized their relationship. "Do you think we would have found each other if things had been different? If my father hadn't been desperate, if Volkov hadn't been there that night?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Eleanor asked something that mattered. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I like to think that somehow, somewhere, we would have recognized what we needed in each other. Even if I'd been some other man's wife, even if you'd still been grieving Sarah, even then. Because what we have isn't just about timing or circumstances. It's about two people who chose to see the best in each other when the world was showing us its worst." Eleanor smiled and squeezed his hand, the gesture carrying decades of shared experience and mutual affection. "I never thanked you properly, you know. For that night, for the choice you made. You've thanked me every day for 20 years, Eleanor. Every morning when you wake up beside me, every time you laugh at my terrible jokes, every moment you choose to stay when you could choose to go. That's thanks enough for any man." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd started as property to be bartered, a debt to be paid in flesh and servitude. But Samuel had seen something worth saving, worth investing in, worth loving. More importantly, he'd given her the chance to see it in herself. The girl who'd been sold by her father to pay his debts was gone, transformed into a woman who'd paid her own way through life with courage, determination, and love freely given. She'd learned that true freedom wasn't the absence of obligation, but the power to choose which obligations to accept and which to reject. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice carrying across the desert like a song of wild places and untamed dreams. Eleanor listened to the familiar sound, remembering a time when such calls had frightened her, when everything about this harsh land had seemed alien and threatening. Now the desert was home, its moods and rhythms as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd learned to read the weather in cloud formations, to find water in seemingly barren ground, to see beauty in landscapes that others dismissed as wasteland. Most importantly, she'd learned that home wasn't a place you were born to, but a place you chose to build with people who chose to build it with you. As Samuel rose to check on the horses one final time before bed, Eleanor remained on the porch for a few more minutes, savoring the peace of the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make, new opportunities to choose love over fear, hope over despair, courage over resignation. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, home with the man who'd shown her that freedom was worth any price, and that love freely given was the most valuable currency in any territory, wild or tamed. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, witnessing the quiet triumph of two hearts that had found their way to each other through darkness and emerged into light. Whole and unbroken, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to their corner of the endless frontier.